The title of my sermon for this morning is Make Sure of Your Focus. It is directly tied in to the themes that I have begun back at the last sermon that I gave in July it was, and then the sermon I gave, I believe it was last Sabbath. And this one is tied into the 5-year or the period, 5 or 6 years after we leave the Feast of Tabernacles, because I think that that has an opportunity to be a place of potentially very great growth for those of us in the Church of the Great God. Now, I want this quotation that I will give you in a moment to be a guide for the theme for this sermon, which I intend for you to apply as a be alert for what we might face as we leave the festival season behind and head back to this world of confusing and dispiriting uncertainties. Now, this quotation was made by George Peabody. And I would really be surprised if anybody in here ever heard of George Peabody. I never heard of George Peabody, but it piqued my interest. And so I did a little bit of looking up, and I'll get to that in just a moment. Because I cannot ever recall ever hearing him before until I began preparing this sermon. But I looked him up on Google and discovered he became very wealthy selling dry goods. I believe it was in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. But then he moved into banking, representing American banking interests in London, England, and eventually he moved back to the United States again. And he is recognized for two qualities. One was his banking astuteness, representing American business interests in London, and he is especially recognized as one of the fathers of philanthropy. Or what did I think I, yeah. And it's really there that he made his name. As a banker, he didn't really make a name, but before about philanthropy, he actually made his name, and he made it because of his interest in philanthropy. Now, here's a definition of it. It's the effort to promote happiness or social elevation by making donations from one's wealth. It's the effort to promote happiness by social elevation by making donations from one's wealth. Well, because he was involved in those two businesses, that is the selling of dry goods and in the banking as well, he moved in pretty wealthy circles. And he began to hear in the conversations of some of those people who had a lot more money than even he did. He was pretty wealthy, but these people had a lot more money than he did. And one of their complaints was, or comments and complaints was, that they would contribute more money to charity if they were sure that the charities were going to be honest in the distribution of the monies that they gave. I'm talking here about people like the Fords, the Mellons. You see, he moved in those kind of circles in Philadelphia. And somehow or another, this contact with these people led him to work for the United States government in one particular area that had to do with charitable givings. And he is one of the fathers of philanthropy because it was he who organized a great deal of what we know of as here in this area here. We are a 501c3 charitable organization. Those things were organized. He didn't found them, but those things were organized by him and put it into the position where people like the Fords and the Mellons and so forth were willing to give of their money because the charities were being checked out as nothing but scams that were run by people who had the opportunity to do so. And so that's why he is recognized as one of the fathers of modern philanthropy. Now, I do not know the situation existing about which he stated what I will quote, but I believe that the sense is fitting. The sense of this statement is fitting for what I believe our looming circumstances in American life seem to be headed toward. George Peabody said this. Now, like I said, I don't know what was going on, but it is an appropriate statement for us. And we have going back to the world that we live in with this in mind. Quote, "Our task is not to bring order out of chaos, but to get work done in the midst of chaos." Our task is not to bring order out of chaos, but to get work done in the midst of chaos. Now, I will make that more direct. What we have to do when we get out of here, out of the Feast of Tabernacles and back to work once again in our areas, what we have to do is to truly work at our calling without allowing distractions to God's calling deter us from our responsibilities to the Father and the Son. I will give you that again. I think that he might have said this as they began their work on the charitable giving for the United States of America. He said, "Our task is not to bring order out of chaos." Because that's what his rich friends were saying. They would give more money to in charitable giving if it wasn't so chaotic, and whether they understood that their money was being wisely invested there. So our task is not to bring order out of chaos, but to get work done in the midst of chaos. And so I interpreted this way, is what we have to do is to truly work at our calling without allowing distractions to God's calling deter us from our responsibilities to the Father and the Son. That is job number one in our lives. Now, I presently believe that despite the bad reports we are hearing week after week, I do not believe the bottom has yet been hit in this nation regarding America's godless and great immorality, nor our political, educational, economic, and religious declines as well. But Americans' declines will impact on us. It can't help but do it. We live here, and it's going to affect us. I also do not believe at this time that Christ will return within the coming 5 years or so. Now, that is just my personal opinion, and it is based mostly on an absence of certain events that are to happen outside the borders of this nation and Britain as the beast rises to clearer recognition. Brethren, where is the one that the Bible calls the beast? Who is he? Now, I am not hearing of him operating outside the borders of this nation. But nonetheless, I believe that we will hear more bad news and more intensifying anger like we are already hearing, only it will be still gradually and continuously worsening. In other words, this gradually intensifying chaos we are living in, right on the edge of, will continue peaking, and there will be no times of real peace. Remember, I'm talking about the next 5 years or so. Now, in one sense, it seems to me that Christ's return is taking a long, long time coming. But I also believe that that is good. I once heard a man say regarding the slowness of a continuing bleeding of a wealthy nation's wealth, his comment was that it takes a long time to bleed an elephant to death. He meant the nation that was being bled was really nothing but a big fat elephant anyway. But it takes a long time to bring it down. Nonetheless, this creative process of getting the world prepared for Christ's return creates circumstances that can be of significant danger to our salvation if we are not on the alert. And even though bombs are not falling from the sky and massive explosions are not going off, the wearying effect of what we are already aware of not only takes longer, but it can be every bit as destructive to one's spiritual well-being. It wears you out, getting constantly bad news of the country that you live in and that you love. But God has willed that we must go through it, even though James 3 and verse 18 clearly states that the fruits of righteousness are sown in peace by those who make peace. Peace is what is best for God's children to produce the most continued growth, but God has willed this state that we are now living in for right now. How long can one live through constant uncertainty with the pressures of constantly rising and still glorify the Lord Christ? With God's help, it can be done, and it becomes more difficult in terms of a test of our faith. But let's face it, brethren, we must not allow ourselves to become weary in well-doing. Now, what is unfolding within the Israelitish nations is broadly described in the verses that I will show you momentarily. And as things now stand, there is no way to stop them. God himself will have to do it, and he may determine to allow the intensity to rise even higher. So turn with me in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 33, and verses 1 through 7. Ezekiel 33, and verses 1 through 7. Again, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, speak to the children of your people, and say to them, When I bring the sword upon a land, and the people of the land take a man from their territory and make him their watchman. When he sees the sword coming upon the land, and he blows the trumpet and warns the people, then whoever hears the sound of the trumpet and does not take warning, if the sword comes and takes him away, that person's blood shall be on his own head. Put yourself in that position. He heard the sound of the trumpet, but did not take warning. His blood shall be upon himself. but he who takes warning will save his life. But if the watchman sees the sword coming and does not blow the trumpet, and the people are not warned, and the sword comes and takes any person from among them, he is taken away in his iniquity, but his blood I will require at the watchman's hand. So you, son of man, I have made you a watchman for the house of Israel. Therefore you shall hear a word from my mouth and warn them for me. Now, as I was preparing a comment regarding these verses, it dawned on me that from the time that the angels that God had established to live on and to govern this planet before mankind was created, there have been only short periods, short spurts of peace on earth. There have been almost no extended times of peace. Now, God and his people have almost always had to contend with opponents, because the carnal mind is almost always working overtime in order to satisfy its owner's desires. And here we are anticipating more of the same in our very own homeland. Now here's what research regarding ancient watchmen revealed. First of all, they were a standard military position in the Israelite army. If any of you saw the movie The Lord of the Rings, that series, you saw some of them deployed in their most normal operating location in one of the series, and I believe that that one was the final one regarding the return of the king. Now, the Israelite watchmen were normally stationed in strategic locations, usually on top of a mountain, and he possessed right at his side the makings of a huge bonfire they would light and give warning to if the enemy army had arrived. Now take special notice of what verse 4 again, Ezekiel 33:4 clearly states. We'll read it again. Then whoever hears the sound of the trumpet and does not take warning, if the sword comes and takes him away, his blood shall be on his own head. Now, a person positioned on the top of a mountain with a fire ready to go right at his side, the fire could have been, metaphorically, been the trumpet. Now, what does the watchman do to earn his pay? He observes. He's a lookout. He is especially trained to be alert, to observe potentially dangerous situations, and sound out then the warnings to his countrymen that they must be alert for harmful circumstances that they might otherwise be unaware of. Now, in the church, this responsibility has been given to the ministry. Now, I will read 2 verses from the Amplified Bible as God provides the ministry with these responsibilities. It's possible that both of these were authored by Paul, and I know for sure the first one here in Acts 20 and verse 31 that Paul is the actual speaker. He says, therefore, he was telling these people as he was leaving the Ephesian area and he was going elsewhere. He went to Rome. He wanted to go to Spain. I'm not sure he ever got there, but he possibly did. But he was heading west, and he had spent a wonderful 3 years or so there, and now he was leaving them and going to pastor to others. he's telling these people, therefore, be always alert and on your guard, being mindful that for 3 years I never stopped, night or day, seriously to admonish and advise and exhort you one by one with tears. Boy, he took his job seriously. I kid you not. Now, the second one, he may also have written this. It's in Hebrews 13 and verse 17, again from the Amplified. He says, obey your spiritual leaders and submit to them, continually recognizing their authority over you, for they are constantly keeping watch over your souls and guarding your spiritual welfare as men who will have to render account of their trust. Do your part and let them do this with gladness and not with sighing and groaning, for that would not be profitable to you either. So in watching, church members have their responsibility along with the watchmen as well, because they have to get ready to run or whatever needs to be done to get out of the way of the army that is invading. Now in Ezekiel 33 and verses 1 through 7, this responsibility was given directly to a duly appointed prophet of our God. That is Ezekiel. And it is not fully intended for you and me to be performing this service, on the behalf of our Savior in the streets of the cities where we live. But nonetheless, the principal revelations given here may apply to an individual member at times in very small measures when the occasions are clearly appropriate. For example, he may recognize in the drift of a conversation we are having with an acquaintance that are amenable to end-time events, including the return of Jesus Christ and some other end-time events, then maybe we are to follow the warning admonishment given. But I don't believe that would occur very often. However, as things now stand in our world, the die definitely seems set against the recovery of this nation. Remember, I'm still thinking about the next 5 years or so and what we have to get done in our time given us by God. Now, the overall subject of this sermon may seem unusual for this specific festival, but I consider this subject to always be of prime importance because of a simple reality we are all aware of. And that is, when do we really start thinking seriously enough about the costs involved to us personally if we are not headed in the right direction now during the assigned pilgrimage that God gave us? Now, if you remember my sermon on the pilgrimage, God gives the pilgrimage. He knows what we need, and He sets up a pattern for our development, the finishing of the product that He is making. Now, I mean seriously enough that our thought processes about our calling actually motivates us to steadily work on our relationship with Jesus Christ and steadily work on a program that we have devised of overcoming a weakness and deportment issues in our faith that truly needs to be overcome. When are we going to get working on it? How long are we going to wait? God wants us to be doing that right now, because God already set our course right from the beginning of our calling. Our course, our journey, our pilgrimage will definitely end But where will we be then in terms of a state of growth that God has patterned for us? Boy, when I think of how much time I have wasted already. Evelyn and I were called in 1950, well, at the very beginning of 1959. We believe that we heard the first program of the year that Mr. Armstrong gave on a Sunday, the first week of January. Now, but we do know, all of us, we are in the know to some degree. We do know that life on the whole is gradually becoming, here in the United States of America and Britain, more erratic emotionally. Will it be with many things in our relationship with Christ left undone? Now there are changes that we can make in our spiritual practices to keep loose ends at a minimum, because I believe that this specific festival is really, and I mean especially, meaningful to our growth. Feast of Trumpets. And this year, Trumpets is the festival that designates when all the chips are on the table. It's as though there's nothing left to play. If you can think of a card game. I was told when I was attending Ambassador College classes that there is nothing more written in the Bible that touches on this festival we are observing right now than any of the others. And I have heard speculations from the teacher that it's entirely possible that there is more written about or touches on trumpets than all the others put together in the Bible. Now, as in playing cards, trumpets is somewhat like the last hand for us on what this day commemorates. Because on this day that we are observing, we learned whether we passed or failed. Think off in the future. When was the first time that you kept trumpets? And how many now have you kept? And they keep rolling closer to us every single second. We keep another one. And on one of these, Christ is going to return. The time is winding down. So as in playing cards, trumpets is like the last hand for us on what this day commemorates. On this day that we are observing, we learn whether we passed or failed, whether we ended at the correct destination or at some place other than the right place. Well, I want to help you lessen that possibility that we end at the wrong destination as much as I can. And I want to help you lessen the distractions that get in the way of your accomplishments. And that is my responsibility before God to each of you. We live in a world filled with challenges aimed toward the destruction of the faith that we already have. And I am not exaggerating. The world, as the term is used spiritually, is the greatest distraction of all. In a generality, it is the greatest distraction of all. A world like this one that we live in, has, to the best of my knowledge, never existed in this arrangement before. Never before. Never, as far as I know, have so many tempting, time-wasting distractions been available by doing nothing more than merely flipping an electrical switch. Now, there have always been distractions to a mind seeking them, but never so many, and never so many readily available in such a tremendous onslaught of easy availability with already prepackaged electronic mechanisms, travel facilities, food, clothing, tools, and entertainment, and active recreation that consumes time. And how much of it, brethren, is simply wasted doing nothing except daydreaming? Now, here's a question. What is it that triggers your interest? You have interests. And here are all these gadgets out there that we can get, that we can watch, that we can ride, that we can play with, or whatever. What is it that triggers your interest? Well, maybe it'll be none of them, but something's out there to trigger your interest in something. They're there. Now, whatever it is, it's probably available almost, as the saying goes, in the blink of an eye. This, in one sense, may be the most challenging time to our fully involved attention to God's purpose within the history of God's desire to create a family of beings like Himself and Jesus Christ. God really allowed this world right now to be crowded with interests. I mean, crowded with something to draw our attention. Though it is truly a significant honor to be given this calling at what is building toward the most significant occurrence in the history of God's plan. And that is Christ's return and the establishment of the kingdom right here on Mother Earth. Now, here in the United States, this nation has gone through one of the most acrimonious presidential campaigns in a long, long time. All by itself, that election campaign was possibly far more than a mere 4-year distraction that is still drawing people's attention and attracting us to some degree. Look, it attracted my attention for this sermon. So, how much of what was going on for those 4 years did you pay attention to? You couldn't avoid it. Burning time. Every angle that was put on the radio, we saw on television, or whatever. It was with us night and day for 4 years. And how much time did it burn? Because even after watching or listening to something about it, we carried it with us and talked about it to somebody else. Now, these things aren't evil all by themselves. They are just there. And God is allowing them to attract our attention. Perhaps the last time words this bitter all over the nation might have been in the campaigning in which Abraham Lincoln ran against two other candidates, and he just barely won, even though he was actually outvoted by the combined vote totals of the other two candidates. But out of that turmoil, Americans were probably given, with the possible exception of George Washington, the very best president for the times who could have served in that position at that time. Now, the bitter war of words in this most recent campaign that we've just experienced these past 4 years with so much barely suppressed hatred are ominous indications that there is no way that we can fully escape a negative effect from them. We can't run from it. It's there. And it's going to be on television. It's going to be on radio. We're going to hear speeches about it. You're going to hear sermons about it. There's no way to get away from it, and it will affect you to some degree. We can't avoid it. It's part of this world. But we can at least make the effort to avoid it as much as we possibly can, because we know it's out there. And already, some rabid speculations have been made that Trump's going to run again. He thinks he can beat him this time, so we will see. Now, one of the elements produced during this last 4 years is already a major distraction because it has become the zeitgeist of our times. If you don't know what zeitgeist means, it's a German term identifying that spirit that is ever present within the times we are passing through to bend our attitudes and deportment to what everybody else is doing. This is a major problem we all have. We can't get away from it. It's there. Now, are we going to allow it in some way to shape our mind, to shape our deportment, to shape our position with God? Because it's going to be there. And that influence, the zeitgeist, is no laughing matter. And it is almost never a good spirit that is the zeitgeist that is pleasing to God. And so if it's not pleasing to God, maybe it shouldn't be pleasing to us either. So, here's the warning. We must be aware. It's going to be out there of it, and we are going to have to resist its influence. Now, the reason I am thinking about this subject is because I know that I fear being distracted from what should be of prime overall concern in my life. I get distracted. In fact, I think sometimes I'm too easily distracted. I'm interested in everything. My mind is all over the place. I'm not kidding you. I see something and I wonder, can I use it for a sermon? And I know the other men are this way too, to some degree, because they have the kind of minds that are interested in things and want to know if it can be a teaching tool somewhere. That's my excuse anyway. Now, I will confess that my focus, my prime concern, that is the way that I think, should be in terms of intensity. And it's not pleasing to me when I catch myself paying attention to things I shouldn't focus on. Those things may not always hold my attention for very long, but they do hold it for a while. Now, to be focused, that's what this sermon is, the major theme of this sermon is about. To be focused in this sermon means to have your mind concentrated upon that which is of greatest interest to you, and that you truly want to succeed in doing well within it. And it's your great desire to do well in its behalf as well. And of course, I wrote that hoping that your great interest that you are focused on is the calling that God gave to you and your family. To be focused is to have your mind concentrated upon that which is of greatest interest to you, and that you truly want to succeed in doing well within it, and that your great desire to do well in its behalf. And your great desire, brethren, is to be a truly good representative of God's way of life. And so you work toward that almost constantly. That's what we're employed for. Now, it is my hope that your overall focus in your life is fulfilling your calling. Now, focus has several technical definitions, but I want to zero in on those definitions that fit into fulfilling our calling. Now, overall, focus describes the very center of one's interest, and thus is given his prime attention. Focus describes the very center of one's interest, and thus is given prime attention. And it is that interest that we feel also that we owe our attention to. Now, does it go that far? Do you feel as though you owe your attention to God and Jesus Christ in His calling? Now, is that project which receives the most sustained attention? And focusing, brethren, is sometimes very difficult in this busy world and requires concentrated effort. Now, here are a number of some very brief, pretty much single word synonyms, definitions used on occasions by writers and speakers frequently in order to avoid overusing the term focus. Terms like sharp, sharply defined, clear, clear-cut, centered, distinct, concentrated, bring to bear, zeroed in on. Now, before moving on, let's look at this term from a reverse angle. What is the great enemy of focus? What is the great enemy of focus? We need to focus more than we do. What is the great enemy of focus? Well, it is something that everybody is susceptible to. Everybody is susceptible to, and thus being trapped by it can happen at almost any time except those times when one is really working to hold his mind to stay focused. Being focused requires energy to do so. And if being totally alone does not guarantee no distractions. And brethren, this enemy I'm going to name You can can happen so easily and unexpectedly that one has to pay attention. But even though you're paying attention, it will happen. I can guarantee it. We are dealing here with an absolute. It is distraction. You can't go through a day without being distracted by something, and neither can I. And even if we vow to ourselves, I'm not going to let myself be distracted, we get distracted because the kids do it. This is what I mean when I say you can't avoid it. Totally. It's going to happen. Everybody is susceptible. The key, brethren, is how long do we hold on to it? Now, this term, distraction, has an interesting source. It came into English from a Latin root, which means to draw. Not with one's hand, to draw, as in putting a sipping straw in your mouth and sucking on it. It also, that's what distraction does. It pulls you right in. It also was used in Latin to pull, as in pulling in a fish that you've just caught. It was also used in Latin as divert, as in changing the direction of something so nothing will be damaged. But in our subject at this time, a distraction is what pulls, it draws, it diverts the mind, which in turn creates an interruption of thought and often has action as well. Distraction is truly a multifaceted enemy of even intensely concentrated accomplishment. Nobody escapes it. And as hard as we try to be not distracted, it happens anyway because the kids do it. Or something goes boom out on the street. You name it, and it is a possibility that we will be distracted by it. Like I said, the key is to make sure it's over in a second. And sometimes that takes a great deal of intensive conservation, not constipation. You know what I mean. Distractions are all the things that occupy our attention enough to get a rise out of us. You know what I mean. Now, I read what I'm now going to relay to you because it illustrates how easily distractions affect our thinking. At almost any time, despite our efforts, best efforts, to not allow it to happen. What I'm going to read to you was actually purposely filmed and inserted into the movie Robin Hood, the Prince of Thieves, because it served a purpose within the storyline. Quote, in their forest preserve, Kevin Costner, as Robin, comes to a young man with a bow, taking aim at an archery target. Robin asks the boy, can you shoot amid distractions? The boy takes up the challenge, with Robin right there to witness his expertise with his weapon, bow and arrow. Just a millisecond before the boy releases the string, Robin tickled the boy's ear with the feathers of an arrow that he was carrying. The boy's shot flies high, missing the target by several feet, and everybody watching, laughs. After the laughter of those watching dies down, Maid Marian, standing behind the boy, challenges Robin. Can you shoot accurately amid distractions? Robin Hood takes his bow and takes aim, and just as he releases the arrow, Maid Marian leans beside him and flirtatiously blows into his face. And the arrow misses the target like the boy's shot and glances off the tree behind it and just barely misses a bystander. Even the experts are bothered by distractions. And this is the hard part. It doesn't take much to distract us. This was a feather. So, now what is a possible lesson for us? What it is might distract us. What is it that might distract us so we miss God's mark set for us to achieve? The Greek term translated into English in the New Testament is hamartia. Hamartia. It means in Greek to miss the mark. That's what sin is. It's to miss the mark, like Robin did, because his girlfriend blew in his face. Hamartia is a shooting term and is the single Greek term most comprehensively used throughout the New Testament, and it is translated into English as S-I-N. To miss the mark. Here's a second illustration that I want to give to you. But this one literally happened to the people who experienced it. This was a literal, real-life event. And it saved the lives of the 3 men flying the Apollo 13 space mission, which experienced a major number of what might seem like minor breakdowns to you and me, but where the astronauts really experienced them. So this wasn't a made-up fictional movie scene. On day 6 of this seemingly ill-fated mission, the astronauts needed to make a critical course correction. You know, they're up in the sky there, and there are no signs that said, go this way. But they knew they were off target. And they had to make a correction. But that presented another difficulty. Because if they failed to do it, or failed in attempting to do it, the direction that they were headed might allow them to never return to Earth. They had to get back on track. So to conserve power, they first had to shut down the onboard computer. That's what steers the craft. They had to shut it down. And even with that accomplishment, that adjustment, the astronauts still needed to conduct a 39-second burn by turning the main engines back on again, or they would miss their destination, and that was planet Earth. How then could they steer accurately in what posed the problem, because they didn't know when they turned the engines back on again what direction the engines would actually push the spacecraft? It might push them further off course. They needed to point the craft in a very definite direction. And astronaut Jim Lovell determined that if they could keep a fixed point in space in view through their tiny window, he could steer the craft accurately manually. Now that main focal point turned out to be planet Earth. But now they were off course. And in order to get back on course, as shown in the movie, for 39 seconds, agonizing seconds, Lovell focused on keeping Earth in view through his tiny window, and by not losing his focus on that reference point as he manually steered the craft, he did it, and the 3 astronauts avoided disaster. Now I'm giving these to show you what the result of distraction is. It takes a person off course. Please understand, that's the whole point of what I'm talking about up here. Distraction from our center focus, God's calling, takes us off course. Now here's a final one. This one ended in tragedy. It was taken from an interview of Mrs. Carl Wallenda. Some of you folks, young folks, might not know the Wallenda name, but the Wallenda family produced probably the greatest team of earliest and tightrope walkers ever seen in our times. Tightrope walking requires very, very intense concentration. They weren't faking it when they performed. Their lives were on the line. The people were watching the real deal when Carl Wallenda fell from a cable in San Juan, Puerto Rico, a few years ago. And later, Mrs. Wallenda, listen to this, said that before her husband had fallen, for the first time since she had known him, he was concentrating on falling instead of walking the tightrope. He broke his concentration on what his skill was in. And she added that he personally supervised the attachment of the guide wires, which he had never done before. That showed her the state of his mind. She said he had his mind on the wrong things prior to that walk, and he failed and he died. A break in concentration distracted him. Now let's turn to Hebrews chapter 12. I'm still having my trouble turning these pages. Hebrews chapter 12 and verses 1 and 2. Now listen, because these are really significant verses, probably from the Apostle Paul. Just guessing here, but it seems likely. Now listen to what he says. Therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and every sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Now I'm going to read these verses from 3 different translations, and these are all thought for thought translations. That is, not word for word, but thought for thought. And there are 3 words I want you to sort of note each and every time we go through these. Those words are encumbrance, fixed, and particular race. Encumbrance, fixed, and particular race. And I'll define them briefly after reading the verses. The first one is from the New American Standard Bible. The New American Standard Bible. Quote, "Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God." This next one, same verses, but this time from the Amplified Version of the New King James. Quote, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses who have borne testimony to the truth, let us strip off and throw aside every encumbrance," there it is again, "and every unnecessary weight, and that sin which so readily, deftly, and cleverly clings to and entangles us, and let us run with patient endurance and steady and active persistence the appointed course that is set before us, looking away from all that will distract to Jesus, who is the leader and the source of our faith, giving the first incentive for our belief, and is also the finisher to bring it to maturity and perfection. He, for the joy of obtaining the prize that was set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame and ignoring the shame, and is now seated at the right hand of the throne of God. That's beautiful. The Living Bible. Since we have such a huge crowd of men of faith watching us from the grandstands, let us strip off everything that slows us down or holds us back, especially those sins that wrap themselves so tightly around our feet and trip us up, and let us run with patience the particular race that God has set before us. Keep your eyes on Jesus, our leader and instructor. He was willing to die a shameful death on the cross because of the joy he knew would be his afterward, and now he sits in the place of honor by the throne of God. Now let's look at those 3 words. Encumbrance. Encumbrance is a weight that one has to bear up under. Brethren, if we allow things to distract us, we're losing time. We have to carry that with us. That's time we lost. It could be something physically carried, or a mental burden, like a distraction. Whichever, it really, really holds one back from accomplishment. If you spoke a rare Russian dialect, and you emigrated to the USA, and your lack of English would truly be an encumbrance, a burden. It would put you in a bind. It would hamper you, impede progress severely across you'd have to bear. It would be a major, major distraction until it is overcome. Now the word fixing, in this case, has nothing to do with repairing. It has everything to do with being stationary, rigid, remaining in possession, steady in intent. The astronaut had to keep his eyes rigidly fixed through that tiny window on that pinpoint of light called Earth while he steered the spacecraft by hand for 39 seconds. That was no small task, and it saved 2 other men's lives. Particular race. That, brethren, is the journey God has assigned us when He called us and set us on our way toward His and His Son and our elder brother and their wonderful creative abilities to be reworked into something useful within His faction. His family, I should say. Brethren, distraction produces nothing good toward the kingdom. This is kind of humorous, but my father-in-law had a humorous saying when he really wasn't pleased with the quality of the work that he produced within the midst of a number of distractions. I can still see him in my mind's eye. He would look somewhat askance at what he had done. And he said, "Well, I guess a blind man riding a horse would never notice." Distraction, brethren, its first product, I believe, is at least a break in thought away from directness of thought toward a goal that one has established that they want to accomplish. However, what enters instead is a mental movement toward randomness in thinking instead of resolving the new thought. And this is combined with at least a small measure of confusion, and we may think or even say something like, "Now, where was I?" Which then goes on to include wasting of time in order to get back on track, neglect, carelessness, and slipshod quality work with disconnections in thought, the leaving of things unexplained and undone, inattention to detail, and finally some indifference regarding the overall quality of the product. And brethren, all of these things can really, really be irritating. But that's not my real concern. My real concern here is this. My concern at this time is on Demas, who is mentioned in the Scriptures, and we will pick that up in another sermon.